Hi everyone, welcome to the 11th week of this Introduction to Phonology at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München. I'm Dr. Ryan Sandell, and this week we will be addressing the topic of abstractness in phonological representations. And more specifically, we'll be confronting the problem of whether it should be allowed to posit underlying representations that contain sounds that are never pronounced as those sounds in a language. That is, can speakers have abstract or underspecified information in their underlying representations that results in some underlying segments being pronounced as completely different segments? So in today's lecture, we'll encounter a couple of cases from Spanish and Turkish that pose difficulties for the analytical methods that we have used up to this point, and we'll talk about whether these can potentially be resolved through the so-called abstract method, but then we'll come to asking ourselves whether it's actually desirable to employ this abstract method in phonological analysis whatsoever. So here's the basic problem. So usually when we conduct phonological analysis, we try to assume relatively concrete phonological representations. That is, we try to assume that the underlying representations are as similar to the surface forms as possible. So in general, I know I've repeated many times, if a word or a morpheme is always pronounced essentially in the same way, so let's take the English word cat, and here we have it in a broad phonetic transcription. This word could, of course, have these phonemes, ka and ta, have some allophones, but apart from that allophonic information, this word will essentially always be realized as cat in its plural form, cats. It doesn't result in any allomorphy as a result of producing, as a result of adding this suffix. So it's fairly easy to assume that the underlying representation for this word is something like cat, or we can recover that after we've done some phonemic analysis. Say, for instance, if we add some of the allophones in here, like this ka would be realized with aspiration, for instance, in this position in English. So it's usually fairly straightforward to say, oh, phonemes surface as, for instance, as their elsewhere allophone, except in the environments when there's a phonological rule that says they will be realized as some other allophones. And in our morphophonological rules, there we similarly have phonological environments that say, oh, a morpheme, some sound that is a part of a morpheme will be changed so as to generate some allomorph under some specific phonological conditions. Now, in some cases, here we're first going to be looking at this from the phonemic perspective largely. We're going to see that this basic approach of dividing allophones into an elsewhere allophone and allophones that occur under specific conditions seem to fail. And this could lead us to posit some phonemes, some underlying phonemes that seem never to surface as such. Those would be underlying segments that we will call abstract. So in general, this would be like saying we have some underlying sound X, but its allophones are Y and Z. It's never realized as X, but rather as Y in some environment, call it A, and Z in some environment, let's call it B. And as far as our morphophonemic analysis goes, the standard method that we've developed there has been to assume that each morpheme has a constant underlying form. That is, whenever we encounter cases of allomorphy, alternations in the form of a morpheme, we will assume that we can choose one of those allomorphs as the underlying representation and derive the other allomorph or allomorphs through phonological rules. There are some cases of morphologically determined allomorphs, like the nominative suffix in Korean that we talked about a few years ago. A few weeks ago, it feels like much longer ago. But otherwise, it's essentially just the task of the morphology to put sequence of morphemes together, and then it's the task of the phonology to modify those underlying representations and produce the alternations. So in the English plural morpheme here, like for instance in this plural form of cats, there we know from our analysis of the English plural that we are in fact seeing a conditioned allomorph of the plural suffix. The plural suffix should be analyzed as an underlying voiced fricative, which becomes voiceless in this context following a voiceless obstruent. And for dealing with alternations, allomorphic alternations, we generally try to apply the so-called two-hypothesis method, namely if a morpheme has two allomorphs on the surface, let's call them A and B, then we can try deriving the allomorphs from the different options for the underlying representations, assuming either A is underlying and B needs to be derived, or that the allomorph B is underlying and allomorph A needs to be derived. And we simply try to develop phonological rules that can produce the correct surface representations given one or the other hypothesis about the underlying representation. That's our procedure for phonemic analysis and allomorphic analysis as well. So let's now see what happens if we try to apply these standard methods to some data in Spanish to try to account for stress-conditioned vowel alternations in Spanish. So when we look at the first group here in example 1, we have vowels that alternate between a vowel and a sort of falling diphthong. So in the first syllable of the verb negamos, we deny. When we have it in its first singular present form, there we have the stress in a different position. So notice here, the stress is on the penultimate syllable in negamos, but on the initial syllable in niego. So the difference here is that it appears when the A vowel in verbs like negamos, negar, cerramos, ciego, there, whether we find the vowel A or ye in the syllable depends upon whether it's under the stress. And the same applies to the vowel O, which can alternate with we. So contamos, contrasting with cuento. Poblamos, contrasting with pueblo. So in these cases, it looks like the stress is responsible for the difference between a monophthong and a falling diphthong. However, there are other verbs that don't show this alternation at all, where the vowel remains a monophthong all the time. So the verb for hit, pegar, has pegamos, pego, levamos, levo, the verb for way. So this immediately confronts us with a problem. So on the one hand, we have a group of data that shows alternations between A, ye, and O, and we. So if all of the data in Spanish behaved like the data in 1A, then it would be relatively straightforward to say, perhaps we have underlying A and O. Those have the allophones A and ye and O and we, respectively. And the diphthongized version occurs when the vowel is under the stress. So in that case, we could perhaps derive the diphthongs under the stress, or maybe the inverse analysis would be the case. We could derive the monophthong from an underlying diphthong when it's stressless. But the B cases problematize this because here, these vowels, the same monophthongs on the surface, don't appear to show this alternation. If we assume that we're going to derive diphthongs from underlying monophthongs when they occur under the primary stress, then we should expect to find forms like yeho, or ye, or llevo, which don't actually occur in the data. So our issue here is that what sort of underlying forms are we going to be able to posit here? Well, it's evident that if we choose for the verb, for the stem neg, an underlying representation with a vowel a, we'll do that. With the vowel a, it's clear that for the verb it, we similarly need to choose the vowel a, but if we apply a rule of diphthongization, so let's say that we're going to have the first singular form o, which is going to condition, let's apply a rule of stress assignment. We won't worry about exactly how stress is assigned in Spanish, but the stress will then occur on the first syllable. So now thus far, these forms look identical in our derivation. And if there is some rule of diphthongization, in which we would need in order to derive the form niego, we also won't really worry about the allophonic fricativization of these underlying voiced stops. That corrects, having such a diphthongization rule predicts that we should find a diphthong here too, which we don't. So one other approach could be to assume that, well, these two sets of forms must in fact have different underlying representations. Since we find the alternations in, since we only find alternations in this group, but we don't find alternations in this group, and these always maintain the vowels A and O, then the other approach could be to say, maybe it's just the opposite of what we initially assumed, and in fact we find the diphthong, or sorry, the monophthong, when the underlying diphthong is unstressed. So we can try to invert our phonemic analysis here. So now our phonemic analysis for the alternating cases declares, we have underlying diphthongs ye and we, which become monophthongs a and o when stressless. So now let's try the inverse. So we would then proceed, I'll leave that like that. So now let's try the inverse analysis and go to the case where we'll have stress, a stressless second syllable. And in this case, so there we have almost. The stress assignment rule will give, will assign stress to the second syllable in these forms. And now if we have instead assume a monophthongization rule, monophthongization process, which takes a diphthong ye or we and converts it into a or o respectively, then we can obtain the desired outcomes. So in the first case here, the diphthong would remain because it's under the stress, but here it becomes monophthongized. And here, since we have an underlying monophthong all the time, monophthongization won't affect it. However, we find yet more data in Spanish which will problematize this analysis, which seemed to work at first glance, namely because there are verbs which have these same diphthongs persistently. So there are verbs like diezmar, so first plural diezmamos, first singular diezmo, or to flay, descueramos, and descuero. So in these cases, we find instances of these diphthongs, ye and we, occurring when they are not under the stress. So that would be a problem if our monophthongization rule is positing that underlying diphthongs ye and we should become a and o when they are unstressed. So what we can see here is that for the type of alternation that we see in 1a, regardless of which underlying representation we pick, whether we pick an underlying monophthong and derive the diphthong, or we choose an underlying diphthong and derive the monophthong, there will be some exceptions, because the language shows unstressed diphthongs that don't undergo monophthongization, and the language shows stressed monophthongs that don't undergo diphthongization. So either possible logical analysis for the alternating cases will create incorrect results. So I'll leave you in suspense for a minute, and when we return, we will look at a potential abstract solution to this problem.